You might have noticed that there's a thematic buildup for our panels. The first was living conditions, second was barriers to release, the third was successful reentry, and then finally we wanted to end the day with some discussion about how to move forward. In that regard, we have yet another star-studded, really impressive panel. We have, and I'm not going to do the introductions, we have a moderator who will handle things from here, but we have Danylle Rudin, Reverend LaRue, Soffiyah Elijah, and Lynn Cortella, and of course moderated by Tina Maschi, who's doing double duty, who was just on the previous panel, and so we doubly thank her for her participation. From here, Tina, I will leave it to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Today on panel 4, we're going to be looking at potential strategies moving forward. As panel 3 just outlined, that there are barriers and facilitators to successful reunification of older and aging people with their families and communities. So what's most important is we're identifying what works, what doesn't work, and how we can move forward to fix it. And that has to do with services as well as legal and structural barriers. We have many people here on a panel that have a diversity of experiences that they'll be able to share, from doing community advocacy work and from working within probation, as well as corrections. And we also have Danylle Rudin, who's a funder here today. And also Reverend LaRue, who's works with faith-based institutions. So I would like to first invite Soffiyah Elijah to make comments, who is Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York, to share her thoughts.
Thank you very much, Tina. And thank you to, well, I was going to say the faithful few, but the faithful many. There's a lot of people in this room, and that's really good, because I know it's hard to stay through a whole day of discussions. So a few things that I think would help us to move forward and that are essential. And the first one is we have to get rid of the stigma. And it's kind of been talked around earlier during the day, but I want to talk very directly about it. We have to get to the point where when someone says, I spent time in prison, there's nothing that flashes through your head other than, I want to be supportive. Because we have a default response of judgment. In the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, what did you do? Even if you don't ask it, right? So anybody in the room know that I'm saying the truth about that? Okay. So we have to get rid of that stigma. We have to say, if someone's coming home from prison, the very first thing we need to look at is, what are all the support systems that we can help put in place for them? Has the community really been enriched to provide all the services that they need? And so we have a very clear example in our country as to how this works for veterans. We take young people, men and women, and we train them to be military ambassadors, to go around the world and commit atrocities against other people. And then we bring them back to the United States, and we have a Veterans Administration to provide them with all sorts of services. They get preferential treatment with respect to jobs, with respect to even boarding a plane, all right? So, and military service is what, about 4 years. But then we take other human beings and we put them in cages for 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years, and when they come out, there's no formally incarcerated administration to provide them with the same kind of services. And I would submit to you that if we took the same mindset and provided that wealth of support services for people who are formerly incarcerated, one, we'd get rid of recidivism. Two, maybe we change the public discourse so that we wouldn't have this default response to put people in cages in the first place, because alternatives to incarceration have been shown time and time again to be far more effective. We get more bang for our buck using alternatives to incarceration than putting people in cages. And the last thing that I would say, and this is consistent with the others, is that it is important to get the attention of some people by using an economic analysis, and was alluded to earlier today, but our first and foremost position has to be to put people before prisons. That if we change the discourse such that we look at people as our most valuable resource to this country, then we would not be so quick to put them in cages. The reason it's so easy for us to put people in cages is because we otherize people, and most of the time we otherize people with melanin. So if we get rid of the racism and be really honest about the fact that the reason we have this problem is because we feel comfortable locking up black and brown people in cages and poor white people, then we would be onto something and we wouldn't have to have this conference again in 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, next I would like to invite Lynn Cortella from the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision to speak.
Thank you. First, I'd like to say DOCS really appreciates being invited to speak here. It's been a great day, and a lot of very important information, has come to light. So I'm happy to be part of that, and certainly hope that my experience with the outreach that I've done will be helpful. Part of what I do, and I feel I need to explain that because I come from a different part than everybody else that's been on the panels. I am a registered nurse, and I've worked in the department 12 years, and I've done various jobs, but the most rewarding job that I've done all along has had to do with medical parole and advancing those cases and trying to find those cases within each facility that we have across the state, getting that paperwork together, talking to people in the community about accepting them should they get approved, and making that case to the deputy commissioner who continues that on so that our cases get advanced to the board. And I guess that's one of the big things I see as a positive in the past 3 years, is that cases have increased. And while we don't have as many as each one of us personally and professionally would like to see, there's more than there has been. The law had changed back in 2009 that allowed for people that were not only terminally ill but chronically debilitated to also be able to apply. So we certainly see more of the elderly population and those problems that they have medically being presented. We try to take a proactive case by case basis, but proactively trying to find them and reach them in each facility. So instead of waiting for a letter to come to us to say, could my husband, my brother, my sister be considered for medical parole, we try to go out and find those cases, based on certain medical conditions that are community standard and seem to be, very big out there and important and things we need to take care of. And so we try to do that. We try to look at the ages of people that we have and also look at those cases. They may not all rise to the level right away of being referred, but they are people that I'm watching. And we're building that database day by day, case by case. And so I think that that's really a big change, and I'm very proud of that. And everything does take time. In every state agency, the wheels turn very slowly. And so we want to do our best to improve those numbers and to improve those cases and people that are coming out and should be coming out. And part of that, on the other end, is being able to have a good discharge plan for people. And that's something also that I think speaks to the advocacy that we try to do in corrections. Case by case, again, going out to nursing homes in every community and trying to talk to them about what we do in corrections and what our mission really is for people. Not to keep them there, but to let them be released to the community that they came from, to their family supports, with dignity and with respect, and getting the care that they need. That's very important to us, and as a nurse, certainly I can tell you that that's always first and foremost in my mind with every case I see that comes by or every patient that I may visit. I've heard a lot about, inmates formerly incarcerated, offenders, they're patients to me, and they're patients to us, all of us in the medical departments. Being able to place somebody in the community is a really big thing, right? I can go out, I can meet 5 nursing homes, 3 don't want to give me a tour. But I'm happy to say at the end of a long day or a long 2 days, 2 of those places invited me in, gave me a tour, sat me down, and wanted to hear about what we did in corrections. And it's that kind of education that has to go on at that level. It's wonderful for us all to get together very often, I think, is necessary as well, so we can talk about these things and have an ongoing dialogue of what's needed and what changes have to occur. knowing full well that they take time and they take people and energy and money in most cases, right? But these nursing homes, you know, they're wonderful places, many of them are, and they want to do good work for everybody, not just, you know, someone's grandmother, someone's father, but for the patients that I have as well, because those too are someone's mother, father, sister, brother. Everybody has somebody. They belong to somebody and they belong somewhere. We have to work very hard at those relationships, have to build a lot of trust with them. One of the other recent things that I started doing about a year ago was inviting nursing home representatives and administrators into a correctional facility so that they would be able to meet each other and build some relationships, and they would also be able to ask us questions about what we did and who we are, what our mission is, and I give them a tour and I show them patients so that they can not only see how we care for people, but what we're looking to accomplish. What our facilities look like, what kind of programs that we have, how we give our medical care, how many specialty clinics we have at particular sites. All those things are important to them, and it also, over the past year, has helped allay their fears, because that's one of the common things that we discussed yesterday at my meeting at Fishkill was, you know, what's the problem with accepting people? Why can't you look at my patient review instrument the same as you would look at a medical center's paperwork, and why can't my patient be the same as everybody else's patient that you're looking at? They have the same needs, they may score the same way, you're going to get, you know, more or less the same Medicaid reimbursement once we get their Medicaid. So all those things, and when you break it down for people like that, they see something different, and they see that we have patients. We don't have inmates, we have patients that need care and need to come home. And one by one, it takes a long time, but that's a very big network now that we have, that we can use, of people that want to work with us, that want to accept our patients, and it's very rewarding. And I very much enjoy that part of my job, and that's the bigger part, I think, of why I'm here, is to say that, you know, that's where it has to start. You know, one person at a time, one case, one very important patient at a time, in trying to get them out and get those services together, get nursing homes, assisted livings, other providers to work with us and work the way they work with everybody else. See my patient the same as everyone else's. And that's a very great part of what I do. And some of those barriers, I think, besides the fear that people talk about, they're concerned, of course, about the visitors, the safety of other residents that they may have. And I always try to say to them, you know, come to my unit and see my patients. They're really not any different. My patients need more care. They need more understanding. They need more time to transition. But those are good cases for you, because you're an advocate for so many, and you can be a good advocate for our patients too. You know, and it's that kind of trust. You have to build that little by little in order to do any of this good work. We provide follow-up for those cases. So for every patient that I may be able to send somewhere, you know, within a month we make a visit to make sure that from a medical standpoint they're getting what they need. And if they're not getting what they need, how can we help them get that? Make sure that the staff doesn't have questions. Bring community supervision in with me from time to also speak to them, to give them some training and some in-servicing on what else they could do to perhaps get staff more on board with what we're all trying to accomplish. So lots of good work is being done. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of people to get that all together. And so I very much appreciate, you know, being here again. And like I say, the biggest thing to me is being able to educate people and to continue to advocate for each person individually. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Reverend LaRue, would you like to share your thoughts about how we can move forward together?
Sure. It's not an unfamiliar position that I'm in, as clergy are often invited at the tail end to tie everything up in a nice, neat bow and make everything come out the way we all wish that it would. My role is a little more of a prophet than as a doctor, but I will point out some things from my experience and otherwise that I think are very important. First, I'd just like to say a theological word about the basis of the ministry in which I've been involved for the almost 40 years now, 37, with the Queen's Federation of Churches. It's an ecumenical council, and people are somewhat mystified as to the term ecumenical. What does it mean? It comes from the Greek word oikumene, unhelpfully, which means the place of habitation. Now, how do you get from there to ecumenical? You look it up in the dictionary, ecumenical is likely to be defined as universal, applying to everyone. And that's exactly the point. In the place of habitation, the creation that God has given to all of us, we are here to live together as a common family. Theologically, we understand ourselves to have been created by God and marked by Him with His holy image. We live together in what is God's household. Now think about who dwells with you in your household, and you call them family. Whether they are related by blood or marriage, whether they might be a sojourner, a friend who's there permanently or for a time, but they share with you the living space in that household. They share with you the breaking of bread at table, and they are regarded as family. Now, we don't always get along in family. Sometimes people do things that make them pariahs. But at the end of the day, as much as we disdain what someone might have done, there is no denying that we are related. We are not other. And that, I think, is fundamentally what the problem is, both with the world in general and with us in these issues in particular. When we start to objectify people as somehow other and outside the family, we either ignore, maybe that's the best thing that can come from that, although it's not good, or we demonize. Think of the wars that could have been prevented if we recognized the people on the other side as members of the same family. Think of how we, in looking at anyone in our society, recognizing that person as related to us as a sister or brother, would likely not be so mean or calloused or indifferent if we saw them as family. That, I think, is the fundamental underlying issue here, is that we do not, unfortunately, see people in that kind of family relationship, and we ought. In our society, the easiest way to solve a problem is not to let it be created in the first place, is prevention. The problem that we're dealing with now obviously won't go away in the twinkle of an eye or the passing of a wand, magical or otherwise. But the problems that we have will ultimately dissipate if we solve the underlying problems. And what are they? Well, we say crime. We need institutions to punish people who commit crimes. But look how devious and deceptive we are in naming those institutions. What correctional facility bothers to try to correct? What reformatory reforms? And have you ever known a penitent to come out of a penitentiary? Yet we give these misleading titles to places. The only one that has any logical or rational basis is penal, because we send them there to be punished. What we ought to do is to reduce crime. Now, what causes crime? People who don't have other opportunities for the most part. And why is that? Because they lack good education from the ground up. They lack the opportunity or access to decent jobs that would likely keep them honest. Most people don't want to be dishonest at the beginning, but they're driven to this because they lack those opportunities, and then they get to watch television. And the media shows the extraordinary excesses of the wealthy and the glamorous. And they compare that to their impoverished situation and say, well, you know, I need those things. They don't need them. We don't need them. And yet we're being told as a society that that's what the good life is all about. And if they can't get it through honest work, what's left open to them? When I was pastor of a Methodist church in Maspeth some 40 years ago, I came home one summer in August from vacation to read in the local weekly newspaper that one of my parishioners had been arrested. for bank robbery. Well, this is a nice middle-class community, Maspeth. That certainly startled me. I knew the family. I knew this man. He was a worker. He engaged in siding and roofing. His wife was employed by Delta Airlines. They had 2 boys, young. And I couldn't believe it. And when I got to them, the story that came out was just absolutely incredible. He had been arrested for 1 bank robbery. This is a federal charge. But in the process, he confessed to about a dozen or 14. Now, he was the one-man gang that couldn't shoot straight. 1 robbery netted nothing. The biggest haul was about $2,500. And why was he doing this? Well, he got himself in debt to loan sharks as a result of gambling at OTB. He told me that before OTB became legal, he would never have thought about going to a bookie. But once the government sanctioned public gambling, it was legal, and he got in well over his head too quickly. I visited him when he was incarcerated in the federal prison farm north of Lewisburg, is it? Pennsylvania. I had made a trip out to Ohio and on the way back stopped. And I'm in my late 20s, never been visiting somebody in a prison before, and wondering, what am I going to say to him? And I stewed about this the whole distance from central Ohio to eastern Pennsylvania. When I got there, I was astonished at what he was telling me. First of all, he celebrated some craft project that he was engaged in, painting on plexiglass what looked like stained glass windows. Now, this is a 29-year-old, 30-year-old man with a family and 2 kids. And he just thought this was the greatest thing going. Now, he wasn't stupid. He had a high school education. Then he told me something that I was absolutely unprepared to hear. He liked it there. He liked it there because he knew he couldn't get in trouble. If he were home, he feared that he would take more of his wife's paychecks, which he generally consumed to feed the gambling problem and the bookies, or rather the loan sharks. But there he was safe. He was told what to do, when to get up, when to do it, when to go to bed. People controlled his environment, and he felt safe. This is not the way our society ought to be raising people. We need to be more clear with our politicians because they spend an awful lot of money on these prisons. I'm not really astonished to hear that the private prisons want a 90% occupancy. My suggestion is that we feed them the politicians to fill up those beds. Because I think this is fundamentally a political problem. It's a problem with the elected officials, and it's a problem for the lack of political will. Comparisons have been made routinely about the cost of keeping somebody in prison for a year as being at Harvard for a year. It will be far cheaper economically and far more beneficial for the society if we address the poor education system that we have in place. If we create jobs that are meaningful and not allow the 1% to continue to prey on the poor and those who are at the lower end of the economic scale. We need to be mindful of the history of state prisons in this country, which really flourished after the Civil War as a means to keep slavery alive. Plantation owners needed people to work their fields, and so the prisons were altogether too happy to loan out their prisoners to live in the same bunkhouses where the slaves had habitated to do the same work as the slaves. Now, of course, you couldn't have good, upright white folk doing this, so this grew and created the very basis at the beginning for the racism that inhabits the criminal justice system from top to bottom, from beginning to today. We had reforms about a century ago that began to say, well, we can't just sort of give away this labor to the plantation owners. That doesn't look nice. So we developed state by state a process of leasing the prisoners, not only to plantation owners, but to other private for-profit interests, for a pittance as to what they would have to pay workers on the outside. And of course, the prisoners got their fair share of it, about 5 or 10 cents an hour. This helped to underwrite the cost of prisons. We've got the issue of people, particularly in upstate communities, where jobs are created by prisons, and where, by the way, because of the way the census had done this over the years, they count the prisoners as residents of that community, increasing their share of federal and state assistance to local communities. The whole system is corrupt at the core, and it needs to be dismantled. When we deal with somebody who has offended, the only reason to send them to a prison is because they would be adjudicated as being unsafe to be free in society, the worst of the worst. Others should be tracked into various rehabilitation programs, restorative justice programs that many church groups over the years have pioneered. The opportunity to bring the offenders in contact with people who have been victimized by crime, not necessarily the one that they personally victimized, but people of like crime, in order that those who commit crimes, commit misdeeds, can begin to understand the pain and suffering that they cause, and also to provide the victims with some kind of catharsis that might enable them to move on with their lives. What do? We make it punitive. Scripture tells us quite clearly that the Lord says, "Vengeance is mine." And when we as human beings try to usurp the role of God and provide vengeance, it will inevitably backfire. When our politicians create all kinds of stumbling blocks and barriers by poor education, by lack of jobs, and by engaging in the incredibly damaging program of gambling in the society, we are placing ourselves to prey upon the most vulnerable. Not only would Gene Zak not have been in prison if there were not public gambling, but any number of other people would not have squandered the resource because, as the ads say, hey, you never know, and they entice us. Our society knew well, right after the Revolutionary War, the dangers of public gambling. And state by state, constitutional amendments were enacted to prohibit public gambling in all forms. Those held for 150 plus years until 1969, when the state of New Hampshire amended its constitution to permit the first public lottery since Revolutionary days. And thereafter, the barriers have fallen. You look at the deceptive language that caused the casino amendment to be adopted at the last election here in New York and wonder what's going to happen. Look only to Atlantic City. The increase in alleged property values created monstrous increases in taxes, which drive the people who had lived there for generations out of the community. They could no longer afford to be there. But the promise is for jobs. But the locals only get the jobs as janitors. The big money goes to those who are imported by the gambling interests from other places. But the government, our good old elected officials, see this as a way of deriving governmental revenue without doing that dastardly deed of raising taxes. Dishonesty pervades how this society deals with this and so many other problems. And those problems begin and really end at the doorstep of our elected officials. They are the ones whose lack of vision, political will, and in some cases outright corruption, wind up causing these things to flourish and become stumbling blocks to our sisters and our brothers.
Thank you. to introduce Clinton Lacey, who's a Deputy Commissioner of Adult, New York Office of Probation.
It's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm sorry for myself that I'm late, that I missed out on some of this conversation. I'm happy to be here with the distinguished panel and distinguished audience, humbled to be part of this conversation and to share a few thoughts about this really important issue of the overall impact of the criminal justice system on us as a society as a whole, and on the communities that are most impacted in particular, and then within that, of course, on our elders, a vital, important part of the fabric of our families and of our communities, right? Which I think the current state of affairs regarding the treatment of our elders in general, and in particular to the criminal justice system, leaves us out of balance in a way that relates to what happens to our babies. And so I think an intergenerational lens and perspective is really important. When we talk about what happens to our elders, we're talking about what happens to every aspect of our families and our communities, from our babies to our adolescents, to our young adults, to our adults, right? It's a chain effect. So I think as we think about criminal justice policy, which I wanted to say a bit about, I think that the intergenerational perspective and lens is critical, and what impacts our elders impacts us all. As was said, I'm the Deputy Commissioner at the Department of Probation, and we've been in the process for the last 4 years of a number of processes. One has been a process of culture change, a change in perspective, an attempt to shift the paradigm from what has been part of the larger punitive approach to an approach that looks at the problem of people being involved in the criminal justice system as a social problem with historical roots, as an economic, as a political problem, not just as a criminal, not just applying a criminal lens or a traditional criminologist lens, but applying a broader lens and putting things into perspective, and then thereby responding with services and resources in attempts to empower people to either avoid or work their way out of a criminal justice system which we know is inherently unfair, which inherently disproportionately impacts people of color. And as we know in this instance, as we're talking about today, adversely impacts our elders. And so one of the things that we've tried to do at probation, I digress for a moment to say, adult operations at probation, or the adult system in New York and in North Carolina, begins at 16. So of the 24,000 people who are on probation and adult probation in New York City, about 8,000 of them are 16 to 24 years old. About 3,100 of them are over the age of 50, just to give you a sense of the numbers. And that's one slice, one snapshot of a bigger issue, right? We're talking about the issue of our elders, of what happens in incarceration and their reintegration to the community. But I think even at the point, and even at the small focal point of people on probation, it's imperative for us in our work at probation to have an intergenerational lens and to be thinking about these issues. Broadly speaking, what we've done, I would say our largest, our most important attempt to shift the paradigm from a punitive model. Probation, of course, is one in which people have received a sentence of probation where they'll be supervised as an alternative to incarceration. And traditionally, it's been a process, to put it kind of succinctly and bluntly, trail them, nail them, and jail them, right? Watch people. If they mess up, bring them back to court, right? I'm oversimplifying, but generally that's been the paradigm. And so what we have redefined a violation of probation as a success, right? I caught them. We're making the streets safer. We've defined a violation as a failure, right? A failure of multiple proportions. And so we define our roles now, and in the process of creating an organizational culture where we don't see ourselves as the potential gateway to imprisonment, but as the last barrier to it, right? To in all ways try to prevent anyone from falling further into the system. So quickly, what our signature, I think our largest attempt at probation has been the creation of what we call a NEON, N-E-O-N, Neighborhood Opportunity Network. And the basic idea of the NEON is to do a few things. One is to move our probation officers out of our courthouses and downtown areas of the city and to place them in spaces and in organizations that are largely nonprofits, where there are service providers and advocates and treatment providers whose very purpose is to empower and to support people who are involved in the system. So we're placing our officers there to soak up that culture and to then not just connect our clients to those people who are there, but to begin to take on a perspective, right, that's different, that's about shifting the paradigm. So that's one piece of it. So it enables us to work with our clients in a context of not just the offense for which they were convicted, right? That they're more than what that rap sheet says, that they're part of a family, right? That they're part of a community, part of a neighborhood, and that we would work with them in that context and connect them and help them to empower themselves in that context. And so that's one piece of what the NEON is about, but what it's also about is not just our 24,000 clients, it's about how can we be intentional about empowering, sharing power, right? Bringing community voices to the table. I think of it as community having presence in the discussions and in the decisions around our policy and our practice. Having participation, whether it's as a nonprofit organization, as a resident in a community, being able to participate in the process of justice, not just being a recipient of it, right? And that the third one is power, a power share, where community voice doesn't just get to opine, but actually gets to have a say in things beyond just depending on hoping that the elected officials will make the right decisions. Like, that's pretty much what our voice is at this point. So the idea of the NEON is to create a space and an opportunity for community to be involved in a limited sense, what probation does, but in a larger sense, what justice looks like. So I think that relates to this conversation in an important way, because these community hubs, these NEONs, at least the aspiration, the hope, is that they become places where we can begin to create a new justice system, right? Create a justice process that's drastically different than the one that we presently have. And I think the three pillars that really underlie our attempt, this NEON attempt, which is one effort, there's three key principles. One is that there needs to be, as was articulated, I think you may have said a dismantling, a transformation of policies and practices as we know them, right? Transforming systems as we know them. And that secondly, as a result of doing that there be a real justice reinvestment, right? People use that term a lot, like money saved on incarceration often goes back to probation departments, police departments. Rarely does it reach the blocks from which the people come, right? There's a study, work done by Eric Cordora he talked about the $1 million blocks, right? Where he looked at neighborhoods around this city and around the country, and he added up the amount of money that was spent on incarceration. It came up to millions of dollars on some of the most impoverished blocks in the nation in terms of wealth and housing and education and healthcare, right? And so these millions of dollars that are being spent and earned through the criminal justice system need to be reinvested in the very communities that are being most impacted. Lastly, that the community needs to be engaged, right? Engaged in a real way. So I say all of that to really relate to the conversation in this sense, that as we look at the criminal justice system from the point of police contact, the point of arrest, to opportunities for diversion, to reroute people out of the system, that they never even reach the courthouse, to alternative to incarceration programs, right? To the point of confinement, when people are inside of those institutions, what do they look like, right? They certainly aren't what they claim to be, right? What goes on in there? What connection does the community, the local community and families have to people that are there, other than hopping on a bus and traveling 10 hours to hopefully see them for a little while, right? What impact can we have in the community to really impact what we call reentry? Where's the connection? And then, of course, as people come home, and in this context, as our elders are coming home, how resourced and prepared are they and are we to receive them and embrace them? And I think that the answers to those questions have to come from the families and the neighborhoods that are most impacted. But they're not the ones who are ever asked, right, who are ever resourced to begin to answer that, or rarely are they ever. And so it becomes critical, in my view, that this intergenerational lens be brought to the table when we think about restorative justice, when we think about justice reinvestment, when we think about system reform. So that while, yes, we'll focus on subpopulations of people, we'll focus on our babies, on our adolescents, on our adults, and we will focus on our elders, but we do that in a holistic way so that we can help to create a rational, helpful, healing process when our fellow citizens, our fellow family members have offended, have caused harm to themselves and to us and to the community, that we can come up with a process that truly heals and from the very outset is built to prepare them for whatever that process may be, to ultimately be whole again in our families and our communities. That's what it's all about. And I'm not here to claim that the Department of Probation, NEON, is doing that, right? We're doing some good things. We are intentional about involving our elders, both on probation and the grandmothers and grandfathers and aunts and uncles of our clients in everything we do. We do a lot of events that involve the family. We're attempting to do that, but that's one step towards really rethinking and recreating a system that's just, that's fair, and that's ultimately healing to all involved.
Thank you. Now we'd like to hear from Danylle Rudin from the Florence v. Burden Foundation.
Thank you, Tina. I come to this with a very specific orientation. I've been in the field of geriatrics and gerontology for 30 years. So really my focus is really about, in geriatrics, when we talk about older adults, it's defined as usually people 60 years of age and older. So just keep in mind that my orientation really is toward that particular population. When I started talking to Liz Gaines at the Osborne Association, it was a revelation to me, as Lillian said. I had never thought about older adults in prison at all, ever. And I've been doing this for 30 years. And when we really started to talk about it, it became clear that there are so many parallels between the experience of older adults in prison and what we in the field of aging see, quite naturally, in older people in the community. The specific example that really hit me was when she was talking about her husband and how he seemed to do so well in prison, and then outside of prison they realized there were all kinds of cognitive things going on that they had never seen. And I said to her, that's exactly what happens when we have an older adult with dementia, when the spouse who's the caregiver dies. The family comes home for Easter and says, wow, we thought dad was doing really well, but mom's been gone for a year and he not doing well at all, because the caregiver created, right, the structure, and the person knew what was expected, and also the caregiver also to some extent covered for those issues. And I think in prison, it occurred to me, it's a lot of the same issues. So the next thing that naturally jumped at me was that in geriatrics, we already do a lot of this stuff, and we do it, I think pretty well. The Department for the Aging, which Lillian ran and is now run by Donna Corrado, and now Lillian supervises that as well, we do case assessments, we do care plans, we do occupational therapy, physical therapy. We have senior centers, which really are more of community centers these days. It's not a place for older adults to go eat and play bingo, which is probably what a lot of you think senior centers are. So I think that we have a lot to bring to the table in terms of helping folks get ready to be reintegrated into the community, and then helping them make it happen. When you were talking about going to nursing homes and so on, Michael, how many senior centers in the city? 250 senior centers throughout New York City. we know people in every single kind of possible program and service you could possibly need for older adults. And I think that we haven't brought this to the table because honestly, as William said, it just hadn't occurred to us until several years ago. But we're really excited about it, and I'm particularly excited that the Burden Foundation will be funding a new project, I hope, between the Department for the Aging, RAPP, and the Osborne Association to specifically look at what can we do to help people when they begin reintegrating into the community so that we know what their needs are before they leave, and so that they don't just leave with a list of senior centers. They leave with a care plan, and they know who to call in the community, hopefully, you know, in our community in aging, to help them connect to those services. When I was thinking about where I think, coming from geriatrics, we need to go from here, it was interesting you talked about stigma. I think of it as perceptions. Our perception in geriatrics of what, in general, prison is like and what older adults in prison are like are probably colored, unless we have experience firsthand, honestly, by what we see on television. And I've gone several times to the main correctional center, which is their prison, and it was totally different from what I had thought it was. And the folks who are there are totally different from what I thought and who I thought they would be. And it truly was a revelation to me. And I think what broke the stigma was just understanding what's really happening and who these people really are. I think that another really important thing is to get everyone to the table, and certainly this symposium did that. And I hope that this new project with DFTA, Osborne, and RAPP will also bring everyone to the table. And in my mind, everyone is people from the world of Department of Justice and Corrections, aging, housing, mental health, Medicare, Medicaid. There's a lot of people who need to be around that table. And one group that no one talked about, but is obviously my bias, is funders. You know, my hope would be in the end that the public sector pay for these programs and services in a very rich way, because it's our job. And in aging, it is our job to work with anyone over the age of 60. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, or anything else. What I'm hoping that will happen if we can get funders to the table is that we can really look at this stuff in innovative and creative ways and create some models that work, and then turn around and say to government, this seems to be working, try it. And that's definitely going to be a sell. I don't know too many foundations that really work in criminal justice and looking at the needs of incarcerated people, never mind older incarcerated people. I would say that's me. And the Burden Foundation is a very small foundation. But I have colleagues who work in health, mental health, caregiving, housing. As I've been talking to them, they're all interested in talking about this. Their reaction was the same as Lilliam's. I never thought about it. So we need to get them thinking about it. Thank you.
So one question that I have, and we could revisit this and maybe connect what everyone has said, are there any concrete measures moving forward that you think docs could do that they could implement to further downsize the prison population? And Sophia, you might want to take that one on.
How many days do I have? You know, actually, before I answer that question, I just need to explain one development that occurred during the lunch break. I got word that Abdul Majid, who is the son of Ms. LeBoyd, who we saw in the video or this morning that opened up the program, that he has now been thrown in the box, thrown in the hole. He's in solitary confinement as of today. I don't have any more information than that, but obviously it is of major concern to all of us. He's already suffering from severe medical infirmities, and the fact that he's now in the box is really, really disturbing. So I didn't want to forget to share that with the audience. So some of the things that I think docs can do, and I've shared this with them, the fact that they're watching, they're going to say, we know what Sophia is going to say. So one of the things that I think could happen is that institute a system where everyone who is incarcerated is routinely and perhaps every 2 years evaluated for their classification. Generally, when people come into the system, into the prison system, they're classified primarily based on the nature of their offense and their criminal history. So if someone is convicted of a particularly violent offense, then they're going to automatically be classified as maximum security. And that's pretty much the classification that's going to stay with them most of the time, if not all of the time that they're incarcerated, which is going to shape what facility they can be held in. Now, there's another side of that. It costs a lot more to hold someone in a maximum security facility because you have more officers. The ratio of staff and resident is much, much higher. So the Corrections Officers Union has an invested interest in having people in maximum security facilities because that guarantees more jobs for them. So as we know, generally in our country, if you follow the dollars, you find the devil. So if we instituted a practice of regularly reviewing the classification of people, I am confident that we would find that we could lower the classification for a number of people, because as anyone who's worked in corrections, starting with superintendents, will tell you, the longer someone has been in, the less of a problem they are, if they were a problem when they first came in, because people age out of being difficult. You age out of being difficult on either side of the wall. And so if we reduce those classifications, people could be put in maximum and then minimum and then work release and then home. And we would enable ourselves to guarantee more success stories, because it's much easier to transition from a work release program or a minimum security facility where you've had less restrictions on your liberties to the street than if you go from a maximum security facility to the street. And then we expect people to successfully navigate that. So we could reduce our prison population significantly and guarantee that they would not be coming back by simply reclassifying every couple of years.
Okay.
Could I follow?
Sure.
I just wanted to follow up on that. One of the functions at the Department of Probation, so there's 25,000 people on probation, but so we're charged with the responsibility of doing a PSI, a pre-sentencing investigation report. And theoretically, and we do almost 30,000 of them a year. So for every conviction, and at this point, any conviction when a person is going to be sentenced or is looking at more than a year's time, in other words, that they're going to be in prison and not in the city at Rikers Island, a PSI has to be done. And so of our staff at probation, there's a dedicated unit who that's what they do. When the person prior to the sentence, they interview that person, right, either in person or by video, whether they're incarcerated or out on bail, and they compile a pre-sentencing investigation report. Now, those reports are of varying values depending on the situation. Many people say, well, the judge doesn't look at it anyway. He's already made a promise and the deal's been cut and they're going to plea bargain. So whatever you guys at probation recommend isn't that important. That's one school of thought. Some judges take them seriously, read them thoroughly, and consider what they say. The report is supposed to paint a picture, a full, holistic picture of this individual and make a recommendation as to whether or not they should be incarcerated, should they get probation, and what have you. Traditionally, needless to say, the department over the years has leaned towards incarceration. In fact, just to share a little dirty laundry, even on the template of the forms when we got there, the only way to recommend incarceration was to strongly, in bold black, recommend it, right? There wasn't even an option to sort of recommend it. It was strongly recommended, right? Just to kind of speak of the kind of culture of the agency. Now, so this relates to the comments because this PSI arguably has varying impact on the decision. But what we're told and what we're learning is that it has a larger impact on incarceration, and it can impact, once incarcerated, on classification, and then once they go to the parole board, right? And which can be years later. And as we understand it, people are looking at this report. Now, what we're in the process of doing at probation is trying to overhaul the way those reports are done. Where do we get the information? Who do we talk to, right? What are the questions that are being asked? How deep are we digging? We're incorporating family impact statements and trying to give a better, holistic view. And really, to let the driving question be, what how is justice best served? How is the family, how is this individual, how are we all best served by the recommendation that we make, as opposed to a kind of routine, jail, send them to jail. If any doubt, send them to jail, right? As opposed to recommending an alternative or what have you. So I just wanted to share that. I mean, it's an important part of the equation that it leads to, and we don't have a guarantee on how that institution will read that or use it, but at least do our part to say, when we write a PSI, even if the person is going to prison, that information, perspective is put in there that will positively impact their ability over time as they mature, as they rehabilitate, or what have you, that this PSI is not just another document that can be used to keep somebody behind bars, which, in fact, it has been. So I just want to share.
Thank you so much.
I would just like to say a little bit about the classification, because part of what I do has to do with the medical classification. And every person that comes into corrections gets 3 kinds of classifications. One is for security, one is for mental health, and one is for medical care. And so those things are done initially when they come in, clearly by different people. And when I look at the security part, and I'm not from security, so I don't want to say too much about it, of course, but when I look at those cases, when I have to move someone who's medically ill somewhere else where their needs can be met, and I look at that, I oftentimes wonder, why does that happen? Why do we have so many? I don't have the right kinds of places to put.
And you work there.
And I work there, right, of course, and I want to be honest about that, that it's difficult sometimes to put people in places where their medical and mental health needs can be met, and their security needs, and if they're mobility impaired or if they have sensory issues. All those things are very important and need to be addressed, along with security equally. But when I look at that initially, it makes me look at someone's time that they've initially been given, and that is usually the basis in which they change that, or how often they look at that. So if somebody got 25 years to life, they're probably going to stay a maximum inmate, right, up until that time before that's changed. So, different with the mediums, they're looked at a little bit differently, and those people may be reclassified differently. But I certainly understand, what that is, and I haven't looked at it particularly in that way as far as money and the officer's time and that kind of thing, because I'm looking at it from the medical end, but it's certainly a very good point and something to consider. Thank you.
Okay, we're done now.
Are there any other important suggestions from anyone about how we can learn to work together and what we can do? Anything in addition, after hearing each other's ideas?
Well, I use a lot of rhetoric, I paint pictures of transformed systems and stuff, right? But I think it's like, how do we turn that into policy and practice, right? For me, so much of the problem is about how we view the populations we're talking about. Who are they? How does the system view them? What is their value, their human worth? And to what extent, to what extent is the system willing to invest and to embrace and approach this work as though they were their parents or sons or daughters or family? What would they want for them? And so, when we talk about that, when we talk about the need for compassion and for love and respect, right? Those are nice sounding words, but how do you build that into, even when we talk about community engagement, it sounds nice, community voice. How do you make that real daily policy and practice? It seems to me that that's a critical question, right? So when I was talking about community engagement before, getting community voice, we need to sit down and say, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis when police or the courts or probation is designing policy and practice and programs? Where is the community? Who are the representatives? Where are the ideas coming from? Who's informed about them? What's their opportunity to push back, to debate, to design, right? And so we're struggling with that now, trying to figure it out and taking steps to actually do that. But I think that that's what has to happen for the rubber to meet the road, that, that it moves beyond the ideas that we have. We have the ideas. We know it has to be done. But how do we make that happen?
I actually wanted to add to that, and I'm going to take a step into nirvana for a minute. And that step is that we do roundtables behind the walls. Let's take all the other people who are policymakers, family members, people from the clergy, and go behind the walls and have regular monthly discussions about what the problems are. Because the people who are doing the time know what the problems are. And the people who are running the prisons know what the problems are from their standpoint. But there's a divide. There's an us and a them. And until we change the dialogue so that it's a we problem, it's always going to be a failed solution. So, and that's part of getting rid of the othering, that we're all people trying to address the concerns. People who are doing time don't want to recidivate either. They want to be successful. And their family members don't want them to recidivate, and policymakers don't want them to recidivate. So everybody's saying they don't want them to recidivate, but we're not getting everybody at the table. And since some people are doing time and they have a voice in this, we're going to have to go to those voices to have this dialogue. And then I think we'll come up with some concrete solutions that will be long-lasting and successful.
Tina, I want to say two things. First, as a rule, older people don't recidivate. Our experience has been that older adults, once they're out, are not going back. So I think that maybe we need to separate older people, and I know that in corrections you often think of people over the age of 50 or 45 as being older. Again, from my lens, it's people approaching or over the age of 60. They're not going to recidivate. Once they're out, they're out. I think that the problem that I struggle with, because I work in communities all the way up the East Coast, is I've had a lot of success in Maine. They have less folks in their entire, in all their prisons and jails than we have on Rikers Island. And we've had a lot of success moving things, but the fact is the system and the community is really small. So it's not hard to get everyone on board because there aren't, frankly, that many people to get on board. When you talk about people coming back to community in New York, how many communities are we talking about? Literally thousands. I mean, when you think about what community is, there's all different kinds of ways to define it. It's geographic, it's cultural, it's many things. And I really struggle with this because I feel like I'm not making any headway, really, in New York City. And part of it to me is just the size, our size. And I don't know how to even begin to think about that.
Somebody said 8. Did I hear? Right. Like Eddie Ellis did a study, like
7 to 8 main communities in New York City are the feeders for the prison population.
And that's where we assume people are going back.
It is shifting somewhat because more and more people from upstate are also being funneled into the prison systems now. And part of the reason is because there are fewer alternatives to incarceration programs available in those upstate communities.
Right, absolutely. I think that there is, I definitely appreciate what you're saying about the vast nature.
And think about how many prisons and jails there are in New York and how many prisoners we're dealing with. And how many staff and how many administrators. It's a lot of people.
You know, another thing that we could do, because you asked what other things we could do concretely, and this is very, very inexpensive, actually doesn't cost a penny, is we could change the language. We could stop referring to people as prisoner, inmate, offender, convict, ex-offender, and refer to people as people who are incarcerated, people who are formerly incarcerated, and that way we could start to take away the objectifying of people based on an event that happened in their lives. Now, you might think that's kind of hokey, but language really does affect how we think. And if we start practicing that, you'd be amazed at how you would change the language and practice of others, policymakers alike.
We have about 10 minutes left. We have time for about 1 or 2 short questions. I think we had Alice, and then Nicole, I'll get to you.
So really quickly, I was thinking about when Clinton was talking about...
Here's the microphone.
When Clinton was talking about the changes that have occurred within the Department of Probation that have allowed that particular structure to begin thinking about being an asset for folks that were under the supervision versus trying to trap what we'd seen before before, and I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about what enabled that shift from inside in terms of the administrators and the leadership, and what can we learn about how to try to replicate that in other departments and to face that when we're countered with the opposite countenance? Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, you know, and I've had the chance to do more work on the juvenile side of reform around the country. I think I've been learning some things that I think are applicable to the question overall. And so a lot of reform that's taken place in this country has taken place through various circumstances where you get a commissioner or a chief or leader of a particular agency of probation, be it probation or what have you, who comes in with some relatively enlightened ideas, right? Who doesn't buy into the punitive model, who is forward thinking about these things and engaged on some level in the movement to reform or maybe even to transform. And then you got those who've been in the agencies for a long time who they got religion, right, on the issue. And they for 20 years they were doing it one way, and now they've kind of seen the light and they're starting to change. But so much of this reform has, in my view, now this is not at all to minimize the vast amount of struggle that advocates and organizations and grassroots folks and community organizers do. I'm not saying that they're not critical and have not been important, but so much of the actual pulling of the trigger inside of an agency to change practice has been personality-led, right? So New York City has a Vinnie Schiraldi who, through some set of circumstances, got hired under the Bloomberg administration while they were practicing stop and frisk with Ray Kelly. So it was an interesting thing that we were all in the same administration. We'd be in the same room together sometimes, but, you know, things are complicated, right? And so probation was allowed to kind of move forward with what we were doing without any real pushback under that administration. But he came in, and so Vinnie had a 20, 30-year history as an advocate, running programs, had gotten hired in DC to run the system, so he got his credentials, his bona fides, and then got this job. Then he hires me, who had never worked in a probation department before, but had a background doing direct service and advocacy and put together, you know what I mean? So, but the problem with that is that, you know, system leaders who are pushing the right thing and who are connecting with people and with organizing and advocates and coming together to make things happen, because that's how we've done it with our partners. They retire, they die, they sell out, you know, a number of things happen, and so it can't be driven, and that's why I pushed the community engagement piece, right? There are a full array of community owning this process so that it's not dependent upon, an enlightened, courageous leader who has the particular circumstances or will to push. That's important, and it's really important that we groom and grow that type of leadership inside of institutions, but we can't depend on that, and I think that's still a huge problem, and that's why it's kind of few and far between where you get this kind of leadership. I think the community has to have more of an opportunity to push to make this happen as well.
Yeah, and I think incorporating this idea of human, family, and community development. Communities are organisms. We want to help them build their capacity, which I think you articulated very well. Yes?
Yeah, one thing I'd just like to add to that, I mean, all of that is necessary to get us out of the morass that we're now in. But unless we want to spend our life swatting mosquitoes and treating for malaria, we ought to begin to dry up the swamp.
Absolutely.
We create and put on the books too many things that are labeled as criminal. And some of them start out as simply fines, a way to put money into the government without having to, again, raise taxes, like jaywalking, for example. But some of these finable offenses sometimes lead to jail time. Think subway turnstile jumping. There probably is not one of us in this room that could not be convicted credibly of some kind of an offense based upon the number of offenses that are on the books. It might take us a day or two to commit it, but we do it regularly. think speeding, think maybe spitting on the sidewalk, but certainly jaywalking. I mean, that's kind of a way of life in this city. And if we criminalize this, what it means is that we have given to the police the opportunity to pick and choose who among us is going to be accused of a crime. And then we give it to the prosecutors the opportunity to decide which ones to prosecute, which ones to throw out, and which ones to try to plea bargain and convince that they ought to plead to something so that they can spare the trial. I mean, none of this can credibly, without laughing, be described as justice. And I think that, yes, we need, certainly, and I'm not opposed to the idea that we need to do something to address the plight of the people who are entrapped in the system now. But unless we also move to address the underlying causes of what gives rise to this prison population, we're going to be doing the same thing 50 or 100 years from now. Not us, but our successors.
I think that when you look at older adults, right, a lot of them are imprisoned for the 3 strikes, related to 3 strikes. So we're looking at a lot of folks who were imprisoned many, many years ago, who are still in prison over things that may not be, may not have put them into the system at this point. And I think to go back and revisit that is great. It's also going to release a lot of older adults to our communities, I think, which is, in the end, all of our concern about what's going to happen.
We've looked credibly, and I think are beginning to do something on the lengthy drug sentences. I mean, that's one problem. But, you know, what's the politician's reaction to crime? It's not to put resources where the police might catch somebody the first time they swipe the candy bar, embarrass them, drag them home to their parent, and cause them to think that this is not worth doing in the future. But rather, we arrest people for first offenses that are actually their 100th shoplifting, and then they look at this as simply a cost of doing a successful business. And so what do the politicians do? Well, it'd be too hard or too maybe detached, they think, to invest in this kind of, you know, proper enforcement. I'm talking not about the kind of profiling and that's been going on. But rather, they vote to double, triple, and quadruple the length of sentences. That's the problem. Nobody commits a crime with a calculator to say, if I get caught, I'm going to weigh this against doing so many years. I mean, we've proved this in capital punishment. It's not a deterrent. Most people who commit crimes, if they even think about a negative consequence, think only about the chance of getting caught, and then they decide that they're too smart to get caught. And so any kind of length of sentence provides no disincentive to the criminal act. It's a matter of an apprehension and correction at the first time, which doesn't mean to be doesn't need to be draconian. But that's what will set somebody on a much better path.
We have time for one more brief question and short responses.
Okay.
And, you know, actually, if Nicole, if you ask and Mika both ask questions, how many more? We have 3? Okay.
So I'll just start.
Okay.
All right.
If
So.
you ask 3 questions, and then we'll respond as
Great.
those who ask.
Okay, so my question is about justice reinvestment. I don't know if reinvestment is the right language to use, but the projected savings for the prison closure scheduled for this year is about $30 million. And the DOCS commissioner has already sort of laid out how that money should be used and continue to stay within the correctional system. So my question is, given the conversation that's been outlined today and the fact that many people have raised that language and seem to be inspired by the approach, what is the demand from folks in the room and other organizations that people are working with to see that that money is invested into the community and the services that, you know, were highlighted earlier in the day, and perhaps other sort of demands that various community organizations have? I've seen DOCS commissioner testimony specifically outlining how that money should be used. I wonder
if there's a similar analysis from community organizations in New York City and other areas around the state.
Can we ask the other two questions, and then we can try to tie that in a...
One of the issues that I'm very concerned with, I'm a physician born and raised Harlemite, and I've been just frankly disgusted with how reentry has been addressed in my community. Our community board has, as far as I'm concerned, essentially ignored the problem, and I'm in Community Board 10, which covers Central Harlem. We have asked, the community has asked the board repeatedly to please form a committee where we could pull the whole community together to address the problem of reentry, and to start to develop programs and deal with the whole situation comprehensively. Because you see, I'm concerned when I see young people, boys in the hood and girls in the hood, coming back and standing on the corner. Because we're not giving them something to do, the guy on the corner is giving them something to do. And we watch them come in and out, and we're not doing a thing. But you know what the board created? A public safety committee. Because now, unfortunately, a lot of folks who look like me think that they're really cute living up in Harlem, and they don't have to be concerned about our children anymore. They're going to make sure they gentrify the place as much as possible. And that means not caring about these kids coming back, in fact, trying to push them out, making sure the rents are too much for the people who created that community to even live there, and anybody coming back. So one of the issues, I believe, is that somehow this problem has to be made important enough in the communities that are, I guess you could say, hit up the most, relating to reentry, in which Eddie Ellis, I believe, has pointed out all of these areas. And the community boards, if the people there do not want to deal with that community, they need to get off that board and start dealing with the problems within our community. Because they're serious ones, particularly with these mostly young folk, but a lot of them now, because I'm with RAPP, elderly folk coming out of prison. All of these problems have to be addressed. They're all part of our community.
One more, if you could just finish the question, we'll tie in our responses to all.
Yeah, so there's a model that's based on the principles of restorative justice that's been used to great effect in other states in the context of reentry, called circles of support and accountability. And my question is anybody on the panel aware of anybody having tried to start a COSA program in New York City or New York State?
Okay, so justice reinvestment and restorative justice.
I was going to start with the last question. When I was talking about the neons, part of what we are in the process of establishing, we look at 7 neighborhoods instead of 8, at this point. But I look at, we have these neon hubs in 7 neighborhoods. And so for each of these hubs, by the way, right now they're places, they're like community centers that are particularly focusing on people on probation, but trying to expand to the larger community. I think that they or things like them, maybe not our neons, but community hubs should be points for reentry, should be points for mobilization and organizing around these issues, So I think there needs to be a concentrated effort that speaks to these things. In particular, these circles, that's definitely like an aspiration of ours, that we form these local stakeholder groups, residents in Harlem, in Brownsville, in East New York, right? And other concerned stakeholders in those neighborhoods to, one way we think for them to start to have a voice in what's happening is just a small thing from probation point of view, right? When people are and facing a violation of probation, or their things aren't working, instead of taking them back to court, right, take them to a circle, right? Or maybe even proactively involve them in these circles of support that involve community residents, right? To involve them in what we're doing with that person, with that individual, in a proactive way. It's actually something I want to talk to you and others about, actually building that. But that's definitely on our agenda, that we want to create these circles to do a number of things. And that would be a key part of what the NEON would be all about. Another way of bringing community into actual impacting what we're doing with our folks. So.
Great. Any comments about justice reinvestment from any of our group?
The one thing that I've heard being posited with respect to the cost savings was that a certain amount of money was going to be invested in the communities where prisons were being closed. I haven't heard anything about putting any of the money in the communities where the people who are going to prison are coming from. That's one of the things that I've raised with DOC's administration, but I know that I think we go further up the food chain for that decision.
Any other comments? Okay, so I think our panel is about out of time.